Hello, my friend. Tonight we dive deep into the daily lives of medieval prostitutes, a topic often glossed over in historical accounts, but one that reveals a surprising amount about medieval society, economics, and human resilience. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine yourself stepping back into a bustling medieval city, perhaps Paris, London, or Florence. The sun is just beginning to peek over the timber-bird roofs, casting long shadows down narrow, cobbled streets. The air is cool and damp, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke, livestock, and something distinctly human. You hear the distant braying of a donkey, the clatter of a cart, and the first stirrings of merchants setting up their stalls. But tucked away in specific districts, or perhaps stirring within less reputable inns, are women whose day is just beginning in a very different way. Fair warning, you probably won't survive this journey with your innocent notions of medieval life entirely intact. But frankly, that's where the true adventure begins, isn't it? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And don't forget to drop your location and local time in the comments below. It's genuinely fascinating to see where everyone is tuning in from across the globe. Now, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Society in the Middle Ages often presented a facade of strict moral adherence, heavily influenced by the Church's doctrines, and indeed the Church's pronouncements on sexual purity and the condemnation of non-marital relations were clear and constant. Yet, beneath this veneer of piety lay a complex and often contradictory reality concerning human desires. One central paradox involves the very visible presence of prostitution in many urban centers, a profession condemned by spiritual authorities, yet frequently tolerated and even regulated by civic powers. This dynamic created a strange daily existence for the women involved. For many women engaged in prostitution, particularly those working within established, regulated brothels, the start of their day offered little in the way of personal liberty. Their mornings did not begin with the leisure or choices afforded to others. Instead, they often found themselves confined to the brothel's premises, waking in cramped, shared sleeping quarters. The dawn might bring the madam's watchful eye, ensuring adherence to the brothel's rules even before the first client arrived. There was no gentle awakening to the promise of personal errands or quiet reflection. The morning signaled the impending demands of their work, the nature of their living. Arrangements underscored this pervasive lack of autonomy. Many brothels effectively functioned as closed environments, with women rarely permitted to leave freely or unsupervised. City ordinances, in some places, even stipulated specific hours during which prostitutes had to remain within designated zones or entirely within their establishments. This meant their movements were meticulously curtailed, preventing them from mixing with the general populace in unrestricted ways. It's almost as if medieval urban planners designed specific human traffic patterns for moral containment, ensuring these women remained visibly and physically on the periphery. This constant oversight meant that their mornings, far from being a time of individual agency, were merely the prelude to another constrained day of labor, with little distinction between personal time and professional obligation. The fundamental question surrounding these restrictions often centers on their primary intent. Were they genuinely for public safety, moral hygiene, or simply to streamline the process of controlling and taxing the trade? Whatever the underlying motive, the outcome for these women was a daily reality of limited freedom from the moment they awoke. From the earliest hours of a medieval prostitute's day, marked by enforced confinement and strict routines. We now move deeper into the very core of their existence, brothel life and the daily grind. For many of these women, the brothel was far more than just a place of work. It became their entire world, governed by its own internal rules and a relentless rhythm distinct from other facets of medieval society. Understanding the typical layout of these establishments helps paint a clearer picture. It is a key aspect of historical study that medieval brothels ranged significantly in size and reputation. Some were small, discreet affairs, perhaps just a room or two in a private home, while others were large, multi-story institutions, sometimes even publicly owned and managed by civic authorities. These larger establishments usually featured a common room where clients could gather, drink, and socialize, alongside smaller, more private chambers for the actual encounters. The atmosphere within these walls, particularly during operating hours, would have been a constant swirl of noise, chatter, laughter, the clinking of tankards, and the murmur of whispered conversations. The structure of the day within a brothel was meticulously organized, especially in those officially sanctioned by the city. Once the morning's preparations were complete, the women would be expected to be ready for the arrival of clients. This readiness wasn't just physical, it often involved a performative aspect. They might be required to engage with patrons in the common room, offering drinks, participating in light-hearted banter, or even performing simple songs or dances. This entertainment aspect was crucial, as it helped create an inviting atmosphere that encouraged clients to spend more time and, crucially, more money. It was a constant act, requiring not just physical presence but also emotional labor, as they had to project an image of cheerfulness and availability regardless of their inner state. You can imagine the forced smiles, the practiced flirtations, and the underlying exhaustion that must have accompanied such a performance day after day as the day progressed. The intensity of their work would ebb and flow with the city's schedule. Early afternoons might see a quieter period, perhaps accommodating a discreet client or two. But as evening approached, especially after the workday ended for laborers and merchants, the brothel would come alive with activity. This was often the busiest time, demanding continuous engagement with a stream of diverse clients. Breaks were likely few and far between, dictated by the madam's dictates rather than the women's needs. The relentless pace meant little opportunity for genuine rest or privacy. The management of these brothels varied, but often centralized power in the hands of the madam or brothel master. These figures controlled everything from pricing to daily tasks, effectively acting as an employer and often as a formidable gatekeeper. Their authority was absolute, with little room for dissent from the women under their charge. The relationship was inherently exploitative, with the madam typically taking a significant cut of the earnings, often leaving the women with barely enough to subsist. This constant exertion of control over their labor, their time, and their very bodies defines the grinding reality of brothel life. The ongoing academic discussion often examines the precise nature of these power dynamics. How much latitude, if any, did women have in negotiating their terms of work, or were they merely instruments in a larger profit-making enterprise? The consistent picture, however, is one of systemic exploitation that made the brothel not just a place of work, but a deeply restrictive and demanding existence. From the demanding routines and controlled environment of the medieval brothel, our focus now shifts to the very individuals who fueled this enterprise, the clientele who visited. You might assume a narrow demographic, perhaps only the most marginalized men, but the reality is far more complex. Medieval brothels served a remarkably diverse cross-section of society, revealing much about the unspoken demands and social dynamics of the era. One historical understanding confirms that medieval urban centers were melting pots of various social strata. Cities thrived as hubs for trade, pilgrimage, craftsmanship, and administration, attracting a constant flow of men. Soldiers on leave, traveling merchants far from home, apprentices living in communal workshops, university students, and even celibate clergy or married men seeking discreet encounters, contributed to the demand for sexual services. You would witness a broad spectrum of humanity crossing the threshold of these establishments. The rough hands of a laborer, the calloused palms of an artisan, the cleaner hands of a clerk, or even the more refined grip of a nobleman or prosperous merchant. Each man arrived with his own set of reasons and expectations, reflecting a pervasive need that transcended social boundaries. The motivations for seeking out prostitutes were as varied as the men themselves. For some young men, especially those new to city life and away from family oversight, a visit to a brothel might have represented a rite of passage, an initiation into adult sexual experience in an environment perceived as relatively safe and discreet. For others, particularly long-distance travelers or soldiers deployed far from home, these services provided a temporary substitute for companionship and intimacy, a release from the loneliness and tension of their journeys. For married men, brothels offered an outlet for desires that might not be met at home, or simply the thrill of forbidden pleasures that offered a temporary escape from marital constraints. The cloak of anonymity, especially in larger cities, often allowed men to indulge in these activities without immediate fear of public exposure, though the risk always lingered. Intriguingly, certain historical ordinances reflect attempts to regulate who could visit these establishments, implicitly revealing who was visiting. Some city regulations might prohibit specific groups, like married men or students, from patronizing brothels. While such rules were notoriously difficult to enforce and often ignored, their very existence underscores that these forbidden groups were indeed significant portions of the clientele, prompting authorities to try and curb their activities. This presents a fascinating insight into the perceived social order and the challenges of maintaining it in the face of widespread human desire. It's almost as if the authorities were saying, "We permit this for some, but for you, no, you really shouldn't." The academic discourse concerning the clientele of medieval prostitutes often delves into the broader societal implications of this widespread patronage. Did the existence of regulated prostitution act as a safety valve, preventing more disruptive forms of sexual misconduct in society by channeling male desires into sanctioned, albeit stigmatized, outlets? Or did it primarily serve to reinforce existing gender hierarchies and provide a convenient system of exploitation for a vulnerable segment of the population? The complexity of these questions highlights that the demand for prostitution was not just a niche phenomenon. It was deeply integrated into the social and economic fabric of medieval urban life, sustained by a constant and varied stream of men seeking services that, despite moral condemnations, remained a persistent feature of the era. Their collective presence shaped the daily lives of prostitutes, making the profession an enduring, if controversial, part of the medieval landscape. From the diverse array of men who frequented medieval brothels, let's now peel back the layers to reveal a stark and often brutal truth about the prostitute's existence, financial exploitation, and debt traps. While brothels operated as businesses, the women working within them rarely saw significant profit from their labor. Instead, they were often caught in a relentless cycle of debt, effectively controlled by their madam or owner. The economic landscape of medieval cities made poverty a constant threat for many. It is a fundamental truth of the era that numerous women turned to prostitution out of sheer desperation, seeing it as one of the few, albeit perilous, ways to earn a living when other avenues were closed. For a woman lacking a husband, family, support, guild membership, or inherited property, the alternatives were often starvation or begging. Yet, this desperate choice seldom led to financial independence. A woman entering a brothel, perhaps hopeful for a means to survive, would frequently find herself immediately ensnared in a web of obligations designed to keep her subservient. Upon joining a brothel, a woman would typically agree to terms that were almost universally exploitative. The brothel madam or master would provide lodging, food, and often the distinctive clothing required by law. However, these necessities were never truly free. They were provided at vastly inflated prices, with the costs immediately deducted from any money the woman earned. This system created a perpetual state of indebtedness, ensuring that a significant portion, if not all, of her daily earnings went directly back to her keeper. It was like a medieval credit system, but one rigged entirely against the borrower, where every meal, every threadbare dress deepened her financial hole. You can envision a woman watching her meager daily earnings disappear, knowing that despite her efforts, she was barely treading water. An especially insidious aspect of this control was the common practice of imposing an entry fee or initiation debt. Some madams would demand a substantial sum up front from a new woman for the privilege of working in their establishment, or for supposed training in the courtesan arts. This initial debt had to be worked off before the woman could begin earning any personal income. This meant that for weeks, months, or even longer, every single penny she made was funneled directly back to the madam, effectively rendering her an unpaid laborer. This system ensured a continuous supply of indebted workers, making escape incredibly difficult. You can feel the crushing psychological burden of knowing that your body and time were being consumed, yet you were accumulating no wealth, only chipping away at an insurmountable initial obligation. The academic discussion around the economics of medieval prostitution often investigates the varying degrees of coercion present. Were all women fully trapped, or could some shrewdly negotiate better terms or eventually pay off their debts? While individual circumstances certainly varied, the overwhelming evidence points to a system fundamentally designed to maximize the owner's profit at the direct expense of the women's financial freedom. Legal frameworks, even in cities with regulated brothels, offered little real protection against this economic bondage. These women were often treated more as assets or commodities than as independent laborers with rights. This pervasive financial exploitation meant that for many medieval prostitutes, their daily grind was not just physical and emotional labor, but a relentless, often losing, battle against an ever-present debt that bound them more tightly than any physical chain. It profoundly highlights the extreme vulnerability of these women, caught in a cycle of poverty and systemic control. From the oppressive financial chains that bound medieval prostitutes, let's now turn to a highly visible, yet equally oppressive, aspect of their daily existence. Dress and appearance marked women. Medieval society, fixated on order and hierarchy, used clothing as a powerful visual code, and for prostitutes, this meant being compelled to wear specific garments that publicly identified and stigmatized them. The detailed regulation of medieval urban life is fascinating. It's a key historical insight that many medieval cities enforced sumptuary laws. ordinances dictating what individuals could wear based on their social status, wealth, and profession. While these laws aimed to uphold social distinctions for prostitutes, they served a more insidious purpose. These women weren't just restricted in their attire, they were effectively branded by it. City statutes often mandated particular colors, patterns, or accessories that prostitutes had to wear, acting as a public, undeniable label. It was akin to a medieval uniform of shame, designed for immediate identification. Imagine a woman trying to move through the bustling marketplace. Her movements, her very presence, would be immediately noted due to her legally enforced attire. For example, in towns across Germany, ordinances frequently compelled prostitutes to don yellow scarves or cloaks, a color widely associated with betrayal, outcasts, or even Jewish communities in various medieval contexts. In certain French locales, they might be forced into striped hoods or garments, stripes often symbolizing infamy or villainy in the period's visual language. Elsewhere, a specific type of veil, a distinctively colored belt, or even a small bell or clapper to announce their approach could be required. This wasn't about fashion or personal expression. It was about ensuring they stood out, making it impossible for them to blend in with respectable society. You can almost feel the weight of countless scrutinizing gazes, the whispers that would follow her, and the constant, inescapable reminder of her stigmatized status. The rationale behind these distinctive dress codes was multifaceted. Primarily, they aimed to prevent honest women from being mistaken for prostitutes, thereby protecting the moral fabric and reputation of respectable citizens. Beyond this, and perhaps more pragmatically, these laws functioned as a potent tool of social control. They reinforced the prostitute's marginalized position, making it exceptionally difficult for her to escape her profession or integrate into mainstream social life. Her attire served as a perpetual public declaration of her occupation and her outcast status. A particularly harsh detail is that these regulations were often rigorously enforced, with fines, public shaming, or even imprisonment meted out if a prostitute was caught attempting to conceal her identity or dress inappropriately. It was as if society demanded she wear her condemnation openly, ensuring there was no mistaking her for anyone else. The ongoing academic debate concerning these sumptuary laws for prostitutes often explores their effectiveness. Did they truly deter women from the profession, or did they simply make it easier for authorities to control, monitor, and tax the women while publicly performing their moral condemnation? Regardless of their ultimate impact on the prevalence of prostitution, their effect on the individual woman's daily life was profound. Her clothing was not a choice. It was a constant, public brand, dictating how she was perceived and treated. In every interaction, this visible marker ensured that, no matter how much she might yearn for anonymity or a different life, medieval society had woven her stigma directly into the fabric of her daily existence. From the public branding enforced by distinctive dress, let's now consider a more visceral aspect of a medieval prostitute's daily survival: food and drink, scraps and excess. You see, while their lives were largely defined by scarcity and exploitation, the nature of their profession, particularly in urban brothels, also exposed them to a peculiar duality of sustenance, ranging from meager, barely sufficient meals to the occasional, often problematic, indulgence provided by their clientele. The typical diet for most medieval laborers was, by modern standards, incredibly sparse. Historical evidence confirms that the average working-class person subsisted primarily on grains usually in the form of coarse bread or thick porridge, supplemented by seasonal vegetables, and with meat being a rare luxury for women living under the strict financial control of a brothel madam. This baseline was often even more austere. Their daily meals would frequently consist of the cheapest, most filling staples, designed simply to keep them functional at minimal cost to their keepers. You might imagine a morning meal of watery gruel or a crust of hard dark bread, providing just enough calories to face another demanding day. Their diet was about subsistence, not nourishment or enjoyment. However, the unique environment of the brothel introduced a strange dynamic to their consumption. As places of entertainment and hospitality, brothels were often scenes of client revelry, where food and, more commonly, drink were consumed in varying quantities. This meant that prostitutes might occasionally be offered or have access to leftovers from more lavish meals, or, more frequently, partake in the alcohol provided to patrons. This could lead to unpredictable periods of relative indulgence, a stark contrast to their usual meager fare. It's like a medieval lottery for sustenance, where some days offered fleeting glimpses of plenty amidst the usual deprivation. You can almost visualize a woman, perhaps ravenously hungry after days of poor rations, discreetly accepting a piece of leftover roasted meat, or finishing a client's abandoned glass of ale, a small, desperate supplement to her meager diet. Particularly dangerous aspect of this occasional excess was its inherent link to increased vulnerability. While a small amount of food might be genuinely beneficial, the consumption of alcohol was often encouraged, sometimes even coerced, by clients or madams to lower inhibitions and make the women more compliant. This could easily lead to inebriation, rendering them more susceptible to exploitation, violence, and a further loss of the already limited autonomy they possessed. It wasn't about enjoying a social drink. It was about being made available, a byproduct of the client's own pursuit of pleasure, often turning a moment of apparent plenty into a profound risk. This highlights a peculiar intersection where moments of seeming abundance directly contributed to their peril. The prevailing academic discussion regarding the diet and consumption habits of medieval prostitutes often explores how their reflected their marginalized and exploited status. Did the occasional access to better food or drink offer any genuine improvement to their health? Or did the associated risks of alcohol consumption and forced indulgence outweigh any nutritional benefits? The consensus points towards a complex reality where basic survival often clashed with the dangers inherent in their work. Their access to food and drink was rarely a matter of choice or personal preference. It was dictated by the economic exigencies of their profession and the demands of their clientele. Thus, while others in medieval society might have celebrated feasts with genuine enjoyment, for many prostitutes, their daily intake oscillated between a bare minimum and a dangerous, forced indulgence, constantly reminding them of their precarious and often unhealthy existence. From the fluctuating realities of food and drink, let's now confront one of the most terrifying and inescapable threats faced by medieval prostitutes: health hazards, constant affliction. You see, in an era utterly devoid of modern medical understanding, antibiotics, or effective sanitation, these women lived and worked in conditions that made them profoundly vulnerable to disease, particularly venereal infections, which added a layer of profound suffering and accelerated their decline. Urban environments in the Middle Ages, even the most advanced ones, were inherently unhygienic places. It's widely recognized that medieval cities lacked sophisticated sewage systems, leading to the accumulation of waste in streets and waterways, and access to clean water was often limited. Brothels, frequently cramped, poorly ventilated, and bustling with transient interactions, exacerbated these pervasive issues. The absence of proper washing facilities for both the women and their clients, combined with the high volume of daily encounters, created an almost ideal breeding ground for various ailments. You would find women suffering from common medieval illnesses like dysentery, various fevers, or persistent skin conditions, but also from the unique and devastating dangers directly linked to their profession. It was akin to living in a perpetual germ factory, but one where the consequences were far more agonizing than a fleeting cough. The most insidious and pervasive threat was without doubt venereal disease. While medical professionals of the time lacked a modern understanding of sexually transmitted infections, they certainly recognized their devastating symptoms. Conditions like syphilis, which saw a dramatic surge in Europe during the late 15th century, though its precise origins remain debated, gonorrhea, and other genitourinary infections were undoubtedly rampant within brothel populations. For a medieval prostitute, exposure to these diseases was a daily, unavoidable reality. A single client could transmit an infection, and without any means of accurate diagnosis, effective treatment, or preventative measures, the disease would inevitably spread, causing immense pain, disfigurement, and ultimately systemic organ damage and premature death. You can almost see the visible toll of these ailments etched on their bodies. A cruel irony given their reliance on physical attractiveness for their livelihood, adding to the despair. Any rudimentary public health measures attempted by some city authorities were woefully inadequate. While some municipal brothels might undergo occasional, superficial inspections, these efforts were typically more about containing perceived public nuisance or preventing widespread panic than genuinely protecting the health of the women or curbing the spread of disease. They offered no real medical care, no preventative advice, and certainly no effective cures. The suffering endured by women afflicted with advanced venereal diseases would have been excruciating, leading to chronic pain, debilitating disfigurement, that further deepened their social isolation and an accelerated path towards an early grave. This physical decline, in turn, rendered them less desirable to clients, directly impacting their earning capacity and pushing them deeper into the inescapable clutches of poverty. The scholarly discussion concerning the health and disease burden among medieval prostitutes often highlights the extreme vulnerability created by their profession and the prevailing societal and medical conditions. Was the constant threat of disease merely an unfortunate, but accepted, part of their occupation? Or was it a significant factor pushing them further into destitution and shortening their lives? The overwhelming evidence points towards the latter, underscoring that disease was not just a medical problem, but a powerful accelerant of their social and economic decline. It tragically illustrates that for these women, health was a constant, losing battle against forces they could neither comprehend nor effectually combat. Their bodies, the very instruments of their labor, were constantly at risk, often succumbing to ailments that diminished their lives and compounded their suffering in a medically unforgiving age. From the constant physical degradation brought on by disease, let's now confront an equally insidious and ever-present threat faced by medieval prostitutes: violence and abuse, daily danger, stripped of social standing, legal protections, and often family support. These women were incredibly vulnerable, making them easy targets for exploitation and brutality with very little hope of justice. The power imbalances in medieval society were stark and unforgiving. It's a fundamental aspect of the historical record that women, particularly those operating outside the protective umbrella of a husband, family, or established guild, held very little power. For prostitutes, this inherent vulnerability was magnified exponentially. They were often perceived not as individuals with rights or bodily autonomy, but as commodities for male gratification, or even as vessels of sin. This widespread societal view directly contributed to their exposure to violence from multiple sources: their clients, the brothel owners, and even, at times, members of the public or those nominally charged with upholding the law. Their daily lives unfolded in a constant state of heightened alert, where virtually every interaction carried a potential risk of harm. The forms of violence encountered were varied and often brutal. Clients, frequently emboldened by alcohol, a sense of entitlement, or the belief that a prostitute was fair game, might refuse to pay for services, inflict physical harm, or demand acts beyond what was agreed upon. The lack of witnesses, the woman's marginalized status, and the prevailing societal attitudes meant that such assaults often went unpunished. Within the brothel, madams or masters, focused on control and maximizing profit, frequently resorted to physical coercion to enforce rules, punish defiance, or simply to ensure absolute compliance. Punishments for perceived infractions of brothel rules could be excruciating, ranging from severe beatings to forced confinement. It was akin to a medieval protection racket, but one where the protection offered by the brothel came at the heavy, personal cost of routine abuse. You can almost hear the muffled sounds of struggle from a back room, quickly absorbed by the noisy bustle of the establishment, unheard by those outside who could offer assistance beyond the immediate confines of the brothel. Prostitutes remained acutely vulnerable to violence from the wider populace. They might be assaulted on the street by random individuals, targeted by groups of rowdy young men, or subjected to public harassment, verbal abuse, and even physical humiliation. The almost complete absence of effective legal recourse meant that reporting such crimes was often futile. In many cases, attempting to seek justice could backfire, leading to further punishment or blame being squarely placed on the victim. A particularly chilling detail highlights that even law enforcement, ostensibly tasked with maintaining order, could themselves be perpetrators of exploitation or violence against prostitutes, leveraging their authority for personal gain without facing accountability. This created a pervasive cycle where the very institutions meant to provide safety instead contributed significantly to their peril, trapping them in a system without genuine external protection. The scholarly discussion regarding violence against medieval prostitutes often emphasizes the systemic nature of this extreme vulnerability. Was the violence merely an unfortunate byproduct of their profession, or was it an inherent, even tacitly accepted, component of a system that relied on their debasement and lack of social standing? The evidence largely supports the latter view, indicating that their disenfranchisement and profound social stigma essentially rendered them exploitable without consequence. Their daily existence was not simply a series of transactional encounters. It was a treacherous journey through a landscape where their bodies were constantly at risk, and the pursuit of justice was a rare, almost mythical concept. This pervasive danger underscores the extraordinary resilience, or perhaps the sheer desperation, required for these women to survive, even for a short time, in such a brutal and unforgiving environment. From the constant shadow of violence and abuse, let's now examine a related, yet distinct, layer of difficulty for medieval prostitutes: legal and civic status, controlled lives. You see, their vulnerability wasn't just a matter of social prejudice It was codified in the very laws and ordinances of medieval towns, systematically reducing their rights and placing them under strict, often arbitrary, control by civic authorities. The framework of medieval justice often offered little solace to those on the societal margins. It's a widely acknowledged historical reality that while many medieval cities tolerated prostitution, this toleration rarely translated into genuine legal protections for the women involved. Instead, it typically came with a heavy price of legal disenfranchisement. Prostitutes were often stripped of fundamental civic rights enjoyed by other inhabitants. They might be forbidden from testifying in court against honest citizens, barred from owning property in certain desirable areas, or excluded from participating in guilds and their associated social welfare benefits. This effectively rendered them legal non-entities in many respects, making them easy targets for exploitation without effective recourse. You would find their names noticeably absent from the rolls of respectable citizens, their legal existence a faint shadow compared to others who possessed full legal standing. The laws specifically targeting prostitutes were often dualistic, meticulously designed both to control their activities and to generate revenue for the city. For instance, municipal statutes frequently dictated strict curfews for prostitutes, confining them to specific districts after dark, or explicitly forbidding them from appearing in certain public spaces, such as main thoroughfares, marketplaces during peak hours, or near churches. Violations of these ordinances could lead to immediate fines, public shaming like being paraded through the streets, or even imprisonment. These regulations weren't about ensuring their safety or welfare. They were about containing them, ensuring they didn't corrupt the wider populace or disrupt the perceived moral order. It was akin to a medieval form of human zoning laws, rigorously enforced with often humiliating penalties for transgression. You can almost picture the city watch, eyes peeled for a woman out of place, ready to enforce the strict boundaries of their existence. A particularly striking and cynical aspect of this legal control was the often direct involvement of municipal authorities in the business of prostitution itself. In cities where prostitution was regulated, the town council might actively license brothels, appoint specific brothel masters or madams, and, in some notable cases, directly own and operate municipal brothels. This meant that the very same officials responsible for upholding moral order and condemning sin were simultaneously profiting directly from the trade they ostensibly abhorred. This created a profound, inherent conflict of interest, ensuring that while the rhetoric against prostitution remained strong, the practical enforcement of laws was often geared towards maximizing municipal revenue and maintaining control, rather than genuine suppression or any true concern for the women's well-being. It's like a medieval council meeting where debates about public immorality seamlessly transitioned into discussions about tax receipts from the local brothel. A peculiar blend of piety and profit. The ongoing academic discussion surrounding the legal status of medieval prostitutes frequently explores this profound paradox. How could a deeply Christian society simultaneously condemn and institutionalize prostitution with such clear legal frameworks? Was it a pragmatic acceptance of an unavoidable evil? A cynical economic enterprise to fill municipal coffers, or a complex and evolving blend of both? Regardless of the precise motivations, the impact on the women's daily lives was unequivocally one of profound vulnerability and systemic control. Every aspect of their existence, from where they lived and worked to how they dressed, and critically, their ability to seek justice or move freely, was circumscribed by laws meticulously crafted to brand them as outsiders and keep them firmly in their designated, marginalized place. This legal framework ensured that despite their essential, if unspoken, role in the urban economy, they remained permanently on the margins of medieval society, their lives dictated by the whims of those in power. From the stark realities of legal and civic control, let's now turn to a more personal and often surprising facet of medieval prostitutes: lives, religious life, penance, and piety. You see, despite the Church's unwavering condemnation of their profession, medieval women in prostitution were still members of a deeply religious society, and many sought spiritual solace, practiced devotion, and yearned for redemption, finding paths to faith even amidst their marginalized existence. Medieval Europe was thoroughly permeated by Christian belief. It is a pervasive truth of the era that the Church's influence extended into every corner of life, from the grand ceremonies of state to the most intimate details of personal conduct. Even those relegated to the very fringes of society were constantly exposed to its teachings, its rituals, and its pervasive worldview. For prostitutes, who were ceaselessly reminded of their sinful status by both secular society and ecclesiastical authorities, the twin concepts of penance and salvation carried an immense, often agonizing, weight. They lived under the very real shadow of eternal damnation. Yet the core Christian message of divine mercy and forgiveness for repentant sinners offered a powerful and persistent glimmer of hope. You might envision them, perhaps, kneeling discreetly at the back of a church, or seeking out a sympathetic confessor who genuinely believed in the possibility of universal redemption, finding solace in whispered prayers when no one else was listening. The path to spiritual solace for these women was often fraught with significant obstacles. Many official church doctrines and local clerical practices explicitly forbade prostitutes from entering sacred spaces, or actively denied them access to sacraments like communion or confession, particularly if they remained active in their profession. This created a profound spiritual hunger, an internal conflict between their daily, condemned reality and their deep-seated yearning for divine grace. However, the rigidity of official policy was sometimes softened by the compassion of individual priests, or by the work of specific monastic orders who provided more clandestine spiritual guidance, or offered concrete pathways for women to genuinely repent and leave their former lives behind. This complex interaction highlights a nuanced reality that went beyond simple condemnation. It sometimes offered a difficult but genuine pathway to faith, if one could find it. A particularly poignant aspect of this religious life was the popular veneration of patron saints, specifically associated with penitent sinners, with Mary Magdalene standing as the most prominent example, while modern biblical scholarship often re-evaluates her traditional identity. Medieval tradition firmly cast her as a repentant prostitute, a woman who had fallen into a life of sin but was ultimately redeemed through Christ's boundless forgiveness and transformed into a model of sanctity. Her story, widely disseminated through sermons, popular religious art, and devotional practices, offered an immensely powerful symbol of hope and spiritual transformation for women in similar circumstances. You can almost see a weary, burdened prostitute finding profound solace in the image of Mary Magdalene, a figure who, in their understanding, had walked a similar path of public sin, yet achieved profound holiness. This devotion provided a tangible connection to the divine, offering a deeply personal belief that, despite everything, they too could achieve salvation and eternal rest. The ongoing academic discourse about the religious lives of marginalized groups, including prostitutes, often delves into the fascinating tension between the stern pronouncements of official church doctrine and the often more flexible, compassionate expressions of popular piety. Did the church's harsh condemnations effectively drive prostitutes away from faith, fostering resentment and despair? Or did the universal promise of redemption, central to Christian belief, offer a powerful counter-narrative that continuously drew them towards it? Evidence suggests a complex interplay where individuals, even in the most outwardly condemned lives, found ways to express their piety and seek spiritual comfort, often discreetly, even when formally excluded from mainstream religious practice. This underscores that even in lives dominated by societal degradation, the human need for meaning, forgiveness, and connection to something larger than oneself remained a powerful and resilient force. So, while their days might have been filled with earthly tribulation, for many medieval prostitutes, the quiet moments of spiritual reflection, the whispered prayers, and the hope of ultimate redemption provided a crucial, if often hidden, source of strength and enduring solace. From the internal struggles and solace found in religious devotion, let's now examine the more tangible, yet equally crushing, burden faced by medieval prostitutes: social isolation, outcast status. You see, beyond the legal strictures and the moral condemnations, there was a pervasive, often cruel, social ostracism that relegated these women to the very fringes of medieval communities, profoundly impacting every aspect of their daily lives. Medieval society was intricately structured, built upon complex networks of family honor, community belonging, and reciprocal social ties. To be deemed an outcast meant to be systematically stripped of these vital supports, leaving an individual profoundly vulnerable and alone. For prostitutes, this social exclusion was almost absolute. They were frequently regarded with disgust and deep suspicion by respectable members of society, often feared for supposedly spreading not just physical disease, but moral corruption, and generally reviled as living symbols of sin. You would find them consistently occupying the lowest rung of the social hierarchy, often beneath even the poorest landless laborers or serfs, precisely because they were perceived as morally tainted and fundamentally outside the bounds of decency. It was akin to living within a society that constantly reflected back only condemnation, consistently turning its back and denying any genuine acceptance. This profound social isolation manifested itself in countless daily ways, shaping nearly every interaction and experience. Prostitutes might be explicitly forbidden from attending communal public festivals, from participating in important community gatherings, or even from walking on certain main streets during peak hours when honest citizens were about. Children would be actively warned away from them, and any form of open interaction with respectable women would be almost non-existent, carrying significant risk of social contamination for the latter. The stigma extended beyond their person to their very living spaces. Brothels, even when officially tolerated, were invariably located on the geographical periphery of towns, physically embodying their marginalization. This deliberate segregation ensured that their existence, while acknowledged, was always kept distinct and separate from the mainstream. You can almost feel the chilling weight of countless averted gazes, the hissed whispers that followed them, and the palpable, suffocating sense of being unwanted and undesirable in the very communities where they resided. A particularly heartbreaking consequence of this pervasive outcast status was its long-term impact on the possibility of forming genuine, non-transactional relationships. For many prostitutes, cultivating sincere bonds of friendship or establishing romantic love outside their immediate professional circle was incredibly difficult. if not entirely impossible. Their very identity as a public woman or fallen woman preceded any personal qualities or individual character, effectively closing off any avenues for pursuing a different, more integrated life. Even if they deeply yearned for companionship, affection, or a stable partnership, the entrenched societal prejudice and the risk it posed to anyone who associated with them often made such connections tragically unattainable. This created a profound and enduring loneliness, a constant, gnawing isolation that went far beyond mere physical separation from others. The ongoing academic discussion about the social isolation of medieval prostitutes often explores how this extreme exclusion functioned as a potent form of societal control. Was it primarily a moral imperative, driven by a zealous desire to keep sinners apart from the pure population? Or did it also serve a more cynical, pragmatic purpose, to maintain a readily available, cheap, and easily exploitable labor force? By systematically denying these women any realistic avenues for social mobility, economic independence, or respectability. The reality likely involves a complex interplay of both moral condemnation and economic expediency. Regardless, the impact on their daily emotional and psychological well-being was immense. Their lives were not just physically demanding and perilous, but also emotionally taxing, perpetually spent on the very fringes of communities that both utilized and simultaneously reviled them. This constant social ostracism ensured that even when their bodies were occupied by others' desires, their hearts and souls were often left in a desolate, solitary place, forever branded by the unforgiving gaze of medieval society. From the profound loneliness imposed by social ostracism, let's now turn our attention to one of the most poignant and difficult aspects of a medieval prostitute's life: children, life, and legacy. Despite the harsh realities of their profession and pervasive societal condemnation, women in prostitution sometimes became mothers, a circumstance that profoundly complicated their already precarious existence and raised challenging questions about the fate and future of their offspring. It is a deeply sobering fact from historical records that medieval prostitutes, like other women of their era, could and did become pregnant. Whether through choice, perhaps a desperate attempt to secure some form of future or stability, by accident in a time before reliable contraception, or simply due to the brutal lack of control over their own bodies. Pregnancy was an undeniable and often life-altering reality of their lives. For a woman already existing on the margins of society, pregnancy brought an intensified layer of vulnerability and frequently exacerbated the societal stigma she faced. She might strive to continue working for as long as physically possible, but the increasing physical demands of pregnancy and, critically, the process of childbirth itself would inevitably impede her ability to earn, pushing her deeper into an already crushing financial hardship. You can almost visualize a woman, her body visibly changing, still attempting to solicit clients, her struggle now patently obvious, underscoring her desperate and increasingly difficult situation. The destiny of children born to prostitutes was particularly grim. Without the legitimizing framework of marriage, these children were universally considered illegitimate, a status that carried a heavy legal and social stigma destined to follow them throughout their lives. They possessed no legal claim to inheritance from their father, even if his identity was known, and their mother's profession often served as an insurmountable barrier, preventing them from accessing many respectable trades, apprenticeships, or opportunities for social advancement. For boys, pathways to guild membership or skilled crafts were frequently closed off, severely limiting their economic prospects. For girls, the risk of being forced or falling into their mother's profession was tragically high, perpetuating a brutal cycle of poverty and marginalization across generations. This created a profound intergenerational challenge, making it incredibly difficult for these children to escape the enduring shadow cast by their birth. A particularly distressing truth reveals that some infants born into these circumstances, whether directly within brothels or to women living independently but engaged in prostitution, were tragically abandoned. They might be left on the doorsteps of churches, becoming foundlings, or placed in the rudimentary care of orphanages and charitable institutions. While some of these establishments offered a bare minimum of sustenance and shelter, survival rates in medieval orphanages were notoriously low, with many children succumbing to disease and neglect. Other children might have been raised, at least for a time, within the brothel environment itself, growing up amidst the raw daily realities of their mother's profession. This exposure from a very tender age to the darker, more transactional aspects of human nature would undoubtedly have profoundly shaped their understanding of the world, often leading to deep-seated trauma or a distorted view of relationships. The scholarly discussion regarding the children of medieval prostitutes often explores the societal mechanisms, or lack thereof, for addressing their plight. Did charitable institutions truly provide a viable alternative for these children, or were they merely a holding pen for the unwanted? And to what extent did medieval society implicitly accept a hereditary aspect to prostitution, where daughters followed their mothers simply due to the lack of other options? The complex interplay of religious condemnation, social stigma, and economic desperation meant that these children, innocent of their origins, began life with immense disadvantages. Their daily existence was profoundly shaped by the choices, or lack thereof, of their mothers, and their legacy was often one of continued struggle, highlighting a deeply ingrained societal failure to protect its most vulnerable members. Their presence in the brothel, or their fate after being cast out, speaks volumes about the human cost of a profession both condemned and indispensable. From the tragic fate of children born into the world of medieval prostitution, let's now turn to the grim reality that awaited most women who entered this profession: aging and decline. Grim future. You see, their livelihood was inextricably linked to youth and physical attractiveness, and as these inevitably faded, so too did their value, leaving them with incredibly bleak prospects in a society that offered little safety net for the vulnerable. The reliance on physical appearance was paramount for medieval prostitutes. It is a harsh truth of the period that a woman's youth and beauty were considered her primary assets in this trade. As time passed, and the inevitable processes of aging, combined with the brutal daily grind, the constant exposure to disease, and the emotional toll of their work, began to take their toll. Their desirability to clients would diminish significantly. Wrinkles would appear, bodies would weaken, and the vibrancy of youth would give way to weariness. You would observe their faces growing more haggard, their movements slower, a visible testament to a life lived hard. This physical decline directly impacted their earning capacity, pushing them further towards destitution. The consequences of this decline were severe and often irreversible. A prostitute who could no longer attract clients would find her income plummeting, making it impossible to pay the madam's fees or even secure basic sustenance. This could lead to a vicious cycle. Diminished earnings meant poorer food and living conditions, which further accelerated physical decline, leading to even fewer clients. Many would find themselves eventually expelled from brothels, no longer profitable, and left to fend for themselves on the streets. It's like a medieval employment contract that implicitly had an unwritten clause, valid only while physically appealing, then discarded. A particularly poignant detail highlights the lack of societal support. Unlike other professions that might offer some form of retirement or a more gradual transition, there were virtually no provisions for aging or ailing prostitutes. They were often left to wander the streets as beggars, or, if they were fortunate, might find meager refuge in a charitable institution that took pity on fallen women. However, these institutions were limited and often demanded strict repentance and adherence to religious life as a condition of entry. For many, the only retirement plan was the charity of strangers or, more likely, a lonely death from starvation, exposure, or untreated disease. You can almost feel the chill of desperation as a woman, no longer young, no longer beautiful, looks out onto the unforgiving medieval street, realizing she has nowhere left to go. The academic discussion concerning the fate of aging prostitutes often explores the profound societal indifference to their plight. Did society's condemnation of their profession extend to a complete disregard for their well-being once they could no longer fulfill their role? The evidence strongly suggests that this was indeed the case, highlighting a profound societal failure to provide for those it had, in many ways, enabled or even institutionalized. Their future was grim, a testament to a life lived without protection or true agency. Their eventual decline and often miserable end serve as a stark reminder of the immense human cost extracted by a system that consumed youth and then discarded the remains, leaving behind a legacy of hardship that few in medieval society would openly acknowledge, but which was undeniably prevalent. From the bleak prospects of aging and decline, let's now explore a glimmer of hope, however faint and rare, that some medieval prostitutes pursued: escape attempts, rare freedom. You see, despite the pervasive debt, social stigma, and lack of options, a few women did manage to break free from the brutal cycle of prostitution, often through specific, often arduous, programs designed for their redemption. The chains that bound medieval prostitutes were not always visible. We've discussed the financial exploitation and social ostracism, which combined created a formidable barrier to leaving the profession. Yet, the yearning for a different life, for dignity and freedom from constant exploitation, must have burned within many. It is a historical reality that, despite these overwhelming odds, isolated records and the establishment of particular institutions indicate that some women did indeed find a way out, however challenging that path might be. You can almost sense the flicker of desperate hope in the eyes of a woman who dared to dream of an existence beyond the brothel walls. The primary avenue for escape, if one could seize it, was through penitence and religious conversion. The Church, while condemning prostitution, also preached the power of redemption. Various religious orders, particularly those focused on charity and social welfare, established Magdalene asylums, or houses for penitent women. These institutions offered refuge to former prostitutes, providing shelter, food, and often vocational training in respectable trades like spinning, weaving, or laundry work. The condition for entry, however, was strict and unwavering, a genuine commitment to forsake their past life and embrace a life of piety and chastity. It's like a medieval rehabilitation center, but with a heavy emphasis on soul-saving. A particularly fascinating aspect of these escape routes is that they sometimes involved significant negotiation, not just spiritual but practical. A woman seeking refuge might have had to convince the madam to release her from her debts, or even rely on the generosity of a wealthy benefactor to purchase her freedom. For those in municipal brothels, city councils sometimes had specific provisions for women to leave, perhaps after a certain period of service, though this was often conditional and rare. This highlights that escape was rarely a simple walk out the door. It was a complex process fraught with both financial and social hurdles, requiring immense courage and often external aid. You can almost hear the hushed conversations, the desperate pleas, and the careful calculations involved in securing such a precarious liberation. The academic discussion concerning these institutions for penitent women often explores their true purpose and effectiveness. Were they genuine havens offering true freedom and spiritual solace, or were they another form of societal control, simply moving women from one controlled environment to another, albeit under a religious guise? While their efficacy varied, and the transition to a rigidly pious life was undoubtedly challenging, these houses did represent a vital, albeit limited, alternative to continued exploitation or a descent into destitution. For the few who managed to enter them, they offered a chance at a different kind of life, a form of rare freedom that, while perhaps not what we envision today, was a profound liberation from the daily grind and perpetual danger of their former existence. Their stories, though few, stand as powerful testaments to the enduring human desire for a life beyond suffering. From the rare glimmers of escape, let's now broaden our view to encompass the broader societal attitudes towards medieval prostitutes. Public perception, necessary evil. You see, medieval society held a deeply paradoxical view of these women, simultaneously condemning their profession as a grave sin, while often implicitly, or even explicitly, acknowledging their presence as an unavoidable, even necessary, component of urban life. The moral framework of medieval Europe was, as we've explored, heavily influenced by Christian doctrine, which unequivocally labeled prostitution as a serious transgression against God's law. From pulpits, sermons thundered against the sins of the flesh, and prostitutes were often depicted in religious texts and art as symbols of vice and temptation, destined for eternal damnation unless they repented. This pervasive religious condemnation shaped a strong public disapproval, ensuring that individual prostitutes faced constant social stigma and moral judgment. You would witness pious citizens recoiling, crossing themselves, or offering muttered prayers upon seeing a woman known to be a prostitute, a testament to the ingrained moral revulsion. Yet, despite this fervent condemnation, a remarkable pragmatism often prevailed among civic authorities and the broader male population. It is a striking historical observation that many medieval cities, rather than attempting complete eradication, chose to regulate prostitution. This policy, often termed tolerated evil or necessary evil, was based on the belief that while prostitution was sinful, it was an inevitable facet of urban life, particularly with large populations of unmarried men, traveling merchants, and soldiers. The argument often put forth was that regulating prostitution served to prevent greater evils such as rape, sexual assault against honest women, or other unnatural sexual acts. It was a cynical but widely accepted justification. Better to contain the sin in designated areas than to allow it to spread unchecked. It's like medieval urban planning had a moral exclusion zone, where vice was permitted to exist so long as it stayed within its designated boundaries. This dual perception meant that prostitutes occupied a unique, contradictory space within society. They were simultaneously reviled as sinners and utilized as a social utility. This duality could lead to strange situations. A city council might fiercely condemn prostitution in official pronouncements, yet simultaneously derive significant tax revenue from licensed brothels, or a respectable citizen might publicly scorn a prostitute while privately frequenting her establishment. This hypocrisy was deeply embedded in the societal fabric, illustrating the gap between espoused ideals and practical realities. The academic discussion surrounding this necessary evil perception often explores the precise motivations behind medieval toleration policies. Was it a genuine, if flawed, attempt at social control, or merely a convenient way for authorities to profit from a marginalized population while maintaining a veneer of morality? The complexity of the sources suggests a blend of both pragmatic governance and underlying moral anxieties. Regardless, the impact on prostitutes' daily lives was profound. They lived in a constant state of public paradox, publicly scorned, yet privately sought, morally condemned, yet economically necessary. This meant navigating a world where judgment was always present, but survival often depended on fulfilling a role that society, for all its condemnation, tacitly relied upon. Their existence served as a stark reminder of medieval society's capacity for profound contradiction, from the intricate web of public perception that labeled them as a necessary evil. Let's now examine a direct consequence of this view: urban brothels, official business. You see, the pragmatic approach of medieval authorities often went beyond mere toleration. In many prominent cities, prostitution was formally incorporated into the urban fabric, managed and even directly profited from by the very municipal councils that otherwise upheld moral order. This policy of municipal control represents a fascinating paradox in medieval governance. It is a well-established historical fact that numerous European cities, particularly from the 13th and 14th centuries onwards, chose to actively regulate and even operate brothels, rather than attempting to suppress prostitution entirely, which was often seen as an impossible task. Civic leaders opted for a strategy of containment and commercialization. This meant establishing official brothels, sometimes known as stews, in England, or bordels in France, which were often purpose-built structures subject to specific city ordinances. You might find a grand stone building, perhaps even with a coat of arms, standing as a testament to the city's direct involvement. In the trade, a strange monument to both sin and civic enterprise. The rationale behind this direct civic management was often pragmatic. By bringing prostitution under municipal control, authorities aimed to centralize it, making it easier to monitor, tax, and supposedly to prevent greater social disorder. The city council would often appoint a brothel master or madam who was a salaried employee responsible for the day-to-day running of the establishment, ensuring adherence to the rules and collecting revenues. These revenues derived from fees paid by the women for their lodging and services, or directly from client payments, would then flow into the city's coffers, providing a consistent, if morally ambiguous, source of income. It's like a medieval city council had its own revenue stream from a business it officially condemned. A rather cynical approach to urban finance. A particularly telling detail highlights the integration of these brothels into urban life. Some municipal brothels were even located near public baths, or in areas central to commerce, indicating their perceived role as a legitimate, albeit segregated, part of urban services. The women within these establishments, while still socially marginalized, operated under a form of official sanction. They might be subject to regular health inspections, however rudimentary, and their working hours and prices could be set by city ordinance. This provided a certain, albeit minimal, degree of order compared to unregulated, clandestine prostitution. You can almost envision the city treasurer tallying up the weekly profits from the brothel, completely separate from his considerations of the spiritual well-being of the inhabitants. The ongoing academic discussion surrounding municipal brothels often explores the motivations behind these policies. Were they primarily about public health and order, an attempt to manage what was deemed an unavoidable evil? Or were they driven more by economic pragmatism, a recognition of a lucrative revenue stream that could be tapped for urban development or defense? The truth likely lies in a complex interplay of both, reflecting the often contradictory nature of medieval governance. Regardless, for the women working within them, these officially sanctioned brothels meant their daily lives were subject to a different kind of authority. They were still exploited, still vulnerable, but their existence was now part of a recognized, if stigmatized, civic enterprise, making their profession an explicit, if morally uncomfortable, component of the medieval urban economy. From the regulated, urban landscape of official brothels, let's now shift our gaze to a less visible, yet equally prevalent, aspect of prostitution: rural prostitution, hidden practices. You see, while cities often had designated districts and formal regulations, sexual commerce in the countryside operated under different rules, often more informal, clandestine, and with its own unique set of dangers and realities for the women involved. Medieval society was predominantly agrarian, with the vast majority of the population living in villages, hamlets, and isolated farmsteads rather than bustling urban centers. It is a fundamental truth of the historical record that human desires and needs did not simply cease to exist beyond city walls. While large organized brothels were rare outside major towns, informal prostitution undoubtedly occurred. This often took place in more private, discreet settings, making it harder to track but no less real for the women involved. You might find it happening in local taverns, inns along trade routes, or even within isolated peasant cottages. Far from the watchful eyes of municipal authorities, the nature of rural prostitution was often characterized by its informality and individual negotiation. Unlike their urban counterparts, who might be bound by a madam and brothel rules, women in the countryside might operate more independently, or perhaps under the loose protection of an innkeeper or a local lord. Their clientele would primarily consist of local laborers, traveling merchants, pilgrims passing through, or even the occasional nobleman visiting his estates. Payment might not always be in coin. Sometimes it could involve goods, services, or food, reflecting the more barter-based economy of rural life. This made their economic situation even more precarious, as they might not have direct access to cash. A particularly poignant aspect of rural prostitution was its inherent vulnerability. Without the, however limited, official regulation of urban brothels, women in the countryside lacked even the pretense of civic protection. They were more exposed to the whims of individual clients, the unchecked power of local landowners, and the harsh judgment of tightly knit village communities. Violence or non-payment would be even harder to report, with little in the way of formal justice available to them. There were no designated red light districts for safety. Every interaction could carry amplified risk. It's like navigating a social minefield where the rules were unwritten and constantly shifting. The prevailing academic discussion around rural prostitution often struggles with its elusive nature. Due to its informal and hidden character, direct historical sources are scarce, making it challenging to quantify its prevalence or fully understand the experiences of the women involved. Most evidence comes from court records detailing moral transgressions or from ecclesiastical condemnations, which tend to focus on the sin rather than the lived reality. Nevertheless, the consistent references to illicit sexual activity in rural contexts affirm its widespread existence. This highlights that while urban centers managed prostitution through explicit means, the countryside grappled with it through implicit understandings and often greater personal risk for the women. Their daily struggle for survival often meant navigating a landscape where the line between desperation and opportunity was dangerously thin, far from the regulated, if exploitative, structures of the medieval city. From the shadowy, informal world of rural prostitution, let's now briefly, but importantly, acknowledge a less discussed aspect of medieval sexual commerce: male prostitutes, hidden histories. You see, while historical records overwhelmingly focus on female prostitution, evidence suggests that men also engaged in sex work in the Middle Ages, though their experiences, motivations, and societal treatment differed significantly from those of women and remain far less documented. Societal norms regarding male sexuality in the Middle Ages were complex and often contradictory. It is a historical reality that while the Church fiercely condemned sodomy, broadly defined as any non-procreative sexual act, including homosexual acts, such practices undoubtedly existed, sometimes openly tolerated in specific contexts or operating covertly. This created a space, however small and perilous, for male prostitution to occur. You would find this activity primarily in urban centers, particularly around university towns, military encampments, or bustling ports, places where large numbers of single men congregated and anonymity was easier to maintain. It's like a hidden undercurrent in the medieval world, acknowledged by some but rarely spoken of in polite company. The motivations for men engaging in prostitution were likely varied, mirroring some of the economic pressures faced by women. Poverty and desperation certainly played a role. For some young men, perhaps runaway apprentices or impoverished scholars, selling sexual favors might have been a means of survival. For others, it could have been a way to supplement meager incomes. Clients would likely have been other men, though historical records are often vague on specifics, fearing to explicitly name such unnatural acts. This clandestine nature meant that transactions were highly informal, often negotiated privately, without the kind of public regulation sometimes seen with female brothels. A particularly intriguing, though fragmented, piece of evidence for male prostitution emerges from certain legal or ecclesiastical records, albeit often through a lens of condemnation. For example, some court documents might mention male effeminates or sodomites being punished, and while not explicitly labeling them as prostitutes, the context sometimes implies transactional relationships. Furthermore, certain literary sources, particularly those critical of monastic life or urban depravity, occasionally hint at male-on-male sexual encounters for payment. This provides tantalizing, if incomplete, glimpses into a hidden world. It's like finding fragments of a puzzle, where you can discern the outline but not the full picture. Due to the deliberate suppression of such histories, the academic discussion surrounding male prostitution in the Middle Ages is significantly constrained by the scarcity of direct sources. Was it a widespread phenomenon or a niche activity confined to specific subcultures? How did the social stigma associated with sodomy affect these men's lives and their ability to operate? And how did their experiences compare to those of female prostitutes Given the differing societal expectations and condemnations for male versus female sexual transgression, answers remain elusive, largely because the dominant historical narratives and legal frameworks actively sought to suppress and erase these practices from the public record. Nevertheless, acknowledging the existence of male prostitution challenges the simplistic notion that sex work was exclusively a female domain in the medieval period, hinting at a more complex, albeit largely unwritten, history of diverse sexual exchanges. Their daily dangers were likely intensified by the extreme moral opprobrium attached to their acts. From the elusive world of male prostitution, let's now return to the more common, yet equally complex, figure who wielded significant power over the daily lives of medieval female prostitutes. The brothel madam's power and control, you see. These women, often former prostitutes themselves, occupied a paradoxical position, acting as both providers of a precarious livelihood and severe oppressors who profited directly from the exploitation of those under their charge. The role of the brothel madam was central to the operation of any organized prostitution establishment. It is a consistent theme in historical records that these women served as the immediate authority figure within the brothel, overseeing daily routines, managing finances, and negotiating with clients. They were the primary interface between the women working and the outside world, including city officials and suppliers. You would find them stern and shrewd, possessing a keen understanding of the trade and often a formidable personality, required to manage both the women and the demanding clientele. They were, in essence, the middle managers of medieval vice. The power exercised by a madam over the prostitutes in her brothel was often absolute, mirroring the patriarchal structures of wider medieval society. She controlled access to food, lodging, and often even clothing, charging exorbitant rates for these necessities, thereby keeping the women in a perpetual state of debt. Her word was law within her establishment, and defiance could lead to harsh punishments, ranging from withholding food to physical abuse. This financial and physical control ensured compliance, trapping women who had few other options. It's like a medieval corporate structure, but where the employees were perpetually indentured servants, with no HR department to appeal to. A particularly telling detail highlights the madam's strategic position. She often acted as the liaison with city authorities in regulated brothels. In towns where prostitution was licensed, the madam might be the one paying taxes, reporting to officials, and ensuring the brothel adhered to municipal ordinances. This gave her a certain, albeit illicit, legitimacy and influence within the urban administrative system, further cementing her power over the women who had no such connections. She could, in effect, leverage the city's complicity in the trade to maintain her own authority and profit. You can almost see her in a crisp, if not elegant, gown, haggling with a city official over tax rates. A stark contrast to the threadbare existence of the women upstairs. The academic discussion concerning brothel madams often explores their dual role. Were they primarily exploitative figures, perpetuating a system of abuse for personal gain? Or did they, in some instances, also provide a limited form of protection or stability for women who would otherwise be entirely destitute and vulnerable on the streets? While individual circumstances certainly varied, and some madams may have exhibited a degree of practical care, the overwhelming evidence points to a system where profit maximization and control were paramount. Their power derived directly from the institutionalized vulnerability of the women they managed, ensuring that for medieval prostitutes, the madam was often a relentless enforcer of their daily grind. a figure who held their very lives in her hands. Their daily reality was often dictated by the madam's demands, marking her as a central, often intimidating, figure in their world. From the internal power dynamics within brothels, let's now turn our attention to a particularly grim and specialized form of prostitution that emerged during times of conflict: comfort women, military camps. You see, during medieval warfare, the presence of armies often led to the systematic exploitation of women who were either forced into or desperately resorted to providing sexual services to soldiers, creating intensely dangerous and morally ambiguous environments. The logistical realities of medieval warfare meant that armies, composed almost exclusively of men, often spent prolonged periods away from civilian populations, either on campaign, besieging castles, or garrisoned in remote areas. It is a grim historical reality that these circumstances frequently led to the presence of camp followers, a diverse group including merchants, cooks, laundresses, and, inevitably, women providing sexual services. Unlike the somewhat regulated urban brothels, these military camps were often lawless or governed by rudimentary military justice, making them acutely dangerous places for women. You would witness sprawling, temporary settlements accompanying the troops, filled with the dust, din, and desperation of military life, where women's lives were cheap and precarious. The reasons for women ending up as comfort women in military camps were varied, but rarely involved free choice. Some were camp followers, wives, or partners of soldiers who, through economic necessity, began providing services. Others were women from conquered or besieged territories, seized as spoils of war and forced into sexual slavery. Still others might have been displaced peasants, driven from their homes by conflict, who saw no other option for survival. This dire context meant their engagement in sex work was almost always a matter of coercion, desperation, or a brutal lack of alternatives. It's like a forced medieval employment scheme, but with the constant threat of violence and death. A particularly chilling aspect of this military prostitution was the extreme vulnerability to violence and disease. Discipline within medieval armies, even professional ones, could be brutal and arbitrary, and rules regarding the treatment of civilian women, particularly those deemed camp followers, were often non-existent or ignored. Rapes, beatings, and even murder could occur with impunity, as soldiers faced little accountability for actions against women outside respectable society. Furthermore, the cramped, unsanitary conditions of military camps were breeding grounds for disease, magnifying the health risks we discussed earlier. You can almost feel the constant gnawing fear these women must have lived with, knowing that their lives and bodies were entirely at the mercy of armed men with little oversight. The academic discussion concerning comfort women in medieval military contexts often grapples with the ethical complexities of historical interpretation. How should historians describe the experiences of women who were victims of war, yet sometimes became essential, albeit exploited, parts of a military's logistical and social needs? The consensus points to recognizing their profound victimization within a brutal system, highlighting the extreme dangers and lack of agency they faced. Their daily existence in military camps was a testament to the darkest aspects of medieval warfare, where human life, particularly that of marginalized women, was treated with appalling disregard. Their stories, though often silenced by history, represent a deeply disturbing and tragic facet of medieval sexual commerce, a testament to enduring human suffering in times of conflict. From the grim and perilous world of military camps, let's now consider a less fixed yet equally challenging aspect of medieval prostitutes' lives: travel and movement on the road. You see, not all sex work was confined to urban brothels or military encampments. Many women engaged in prostitution while accompanying various traveling groups, facing unique dangers and an even greater degree of transience than their more settled counterparts. The medieval landscape was one of constant movement, albeit at a slower pace than today. It is a key historical understanding that people traveled for numerous reasons: trade, pilgrimage, administrative duties, or simply to seek new opportunities. This pervasive movement created opportunities for prostitution to exist along the very routes of travel. Women might attach themselves to merchant caravans, follow large groups of pilgrims en route to holy sites, or, as we've seen, accompany armies on campaign. Their daily lives were thus defined by itinerancy, a perpetual state of flux that brought both anonymity and increased vulnerability. You would find them trudging dusty roads, sleeping in roadside inns, or huddling in temporary encampments. There lives a constant journey with no fixed abode. The motivations for such a mobile existence in prostitution were varied. For some, it might have been an extension of rural prostitution, moving from one market town to the next, following seasonal trade routes. For others, it could have been a desperate attempt to escape an unbearable situation in their hometown, seeking a fresh start where their past was unknown. The anonymity offered by constant movement could be a double-edged sword. It might protect them from local social stigma, but it also removed any potential for stable community support or established legal recourse. It's like being a perpetual tourist in your own life, but without the luxury or safety net. A particularly difficult aspect of prostitution on the road was the amplified risk of danger. Unlike the albeit minimal regulation found in some urban brothels, itinerancy meant a constant exposure to unknown clients and unfamiliar environments. With no established madam or civic authority to offer even a semblance of control, violence, robbery, and abandonment were constant threats. Furthermore, access to basic necessities like clean water, consistent food, and shelter would have been highly unreliable, exacerbating health issues. You can almost feel the chill of a lonely night in a crude inn, or the fear of a deserted stretch of road, knowing there was no one to turn to if trouble arose. The ongoing academic discussion about mobile prostitution in the Middle Ages often highlights the challenges of documenting such transient lives. Since these women rarely left behind official records in a single location, their stories are often pieced together from fleeting mentions in travel accounts, legal depositions concerning highway crimes, or the scattered records of inns. This scarcity of sources makes it difficult to ascertain their numbers or the full scope of their experiences. Nevertheless, their undeniable presence reveals that prostitution was not merely a static urban phenomenon, but a dynamic, often hidden, aspect of medieval life that adapted to the rhythms of travel and trade. Their daily struggle involved not just physical labor, but a constant, dangerous negotiation with unfamiliar landscapes and the ever-present threat of the unknown, making their road a path of perpetual peril and profound uncertainty. From the perpetual movement of prostitutes on the road, let's now uncover a less transactional aspect of their daily duties, entertainment and skills beyond sex. You see, while providing sexual services was their primary role, many medieval prostitutes, particularly those in larger, more established brothels, were also expected to offer various forms of entertainment, showcasing skills that went beyond mere physical intimacy. and contributed to the brothel's overall appeal and profitability. The operation of a medieval brothel, particularly a regulated or municipal one, was not solely about quick physical transactions. A crucial historical insight confirms that these establishments often functioned as social venues where men could relax, drink, and escape the strictures of daily life. This extended beyond the purely sexual, encompassing elements of what we might call medieval hospitality and recreation. Women working in these places were frequently expected to contribute to this broader atmosphere, engaging clients in conversation, playing musical instruments, or singing songs. You would find them, not just in private rooms, but in common areas, actively contributing to the convivial, if morally ambiguous, ambience. It's like a medieval nightclub, but where the performers also happen to offer other, more intimate services. Many prostitutes, whether by natural talent or necessity, cultivated a range of social and entertainment skills. They might be adept at engaging in witty banter, telling jokes, or simply listening attentively to a client's woes. Some possessed musical abilities, playing instruments like lutes, flutes, or simple drums, or singing popular ballads and bawdy songs that entertained patrons. Others might be skilled in dancing, providing visual amusement. These talents were not just for show. They served a practical purpose. A woman who could charm a client, make him laugh, or provide engaging companionship might encourage him to stay longer, spend more money on drinks, and potentially return more frequently. This made her more valuable to the madam and, theoretically, could even slightly improve her own standing within the brothel. A particularly intriguing detail suggests that in some higher-end establishments, prostitutes might even possess a rudimentary education. They might be literate, capable of reading aloud from popular romances or engaging in more intellectual conversation, catering to a wealthier or more educated clientele like university students or traveling scholars. This highlights a nuanced aspect of their profession, while often forced into it by circumstance. Some women brought pre-existing skills or developed new ones that transcended the purely sexual. This additional value add allowed brothels to cater to a broader market, offering more than just physical release. You can almost picture a scholar, deep in his cups, listening intently as a prostitute reads a passage from a chivalric romance, momentarily forgetting his moral qualms. The ongoing academic discussion concerning the entertainment skills of medieval prostitutes often explores the degree of agency inherent in these performances. Were these skills simply another tool of exploitation used to extract more money from clients? Or did they offer a small sphere of personal expression and a fleeting sense of dignity for the women themselves? The reality is likely a complex interplay. While the skills were undoubtedly leveraged for profit by the brothel owners, for the women, they might have provided a fleeting sense of pride in their abilities, differentiating them from others and perhaps offering moments of genuine connection with clients beyond the transactional. Their daily grind was thus not just about the physical demands of sex work, but also about the emotional and intellectual labor of performing charm, wit, and entertainment, revealing a hidden layer of their complex daily lives. From the surprising breadth of entertainment skills medieval prostitutes sometimes possessed, let's now explore a more profound and often overlooked aspect of their lives: solidarity and sisterhood, unlikely bonds. You see, despite the harsh competition, pervasive exploitation, and individual suffering inherent in their profession, women working in prostitution often formed vital, if often hidden, bonds of camaraderie, mutual support, and even genuine friendship with each other. creating small pockets of resilience within their challenging existence. The shared experience of marginalization and exploitation often forged powerful, unwritten alliances. It is a compelling historical observation that for women who were often ostracized by mainstream society, their fellow prostitutes became a crucial, sometimes their only source of companionship and understanding. They lived, worked, and suffered together within the confines of brothels or shared lodgings, creating an environment where mutual reliance became essential for survival. You would find them sharing meager meals, offering comfort during illness, or simply lending an ear to listen to each other's woes. This shared hardship became the unlikely foundation for genuine human connection, a lifeline in a hostile world. The nature of these bonds often transcended mere companionship. They could involve practical support and even collective resistance. However small, if one woman fell ill, others might pool their meager resources to help her or cover her duties. If a client was particularly abusive, a fellow prostitute might offer a warning or even intervene if possible, though such actions came with significant risk to themselves. In some rare instances, there are hints of collective defiance against an abusive madam or unfair conditions, a quiet solidarity that spoke volumes about their shared plight. It's like a medieval support group, but one where the stakes were literally life and death, and trust was the ultimate currency. A particularly poignant detail highlights the emotional depth of these relationships. For many prostitutes, family ties were severed or strained due to their profession. In such cases, their fellow women became a surrogate family, offering a sense of belonging that was denied to them by respectable society. They might share stories, console each other during moments of despair, or celebrate small victories. Together, these were bonds born not of choice in a free society, but of necessity and shared suffering, creating an intimate network of support that outsiders could never truly comprehend. You can almost feel the warmth of camaraderie in a cold, lonely room, a quiet defiance against the world that sought to break them. The ongoing academic discussion concerning solidarity among marginalized groups in history often explores how such bonds emerged in oppressive environments. Did these relationships truly empower individual women, or were they merely a coping mechanism within an inescapable system, while their power to fundamentally alter their circumstances was limited? These bonds undoubtedly provided crucial emotional and practical support, making an otherwise unbearable existence marginally more tolerable. Their daily lives were not just about solitary suffering. They were also about the quiet strength found in shared experience, mutual aid, and the profound, often unspoken, understanding that only those who walked a similar path could offer. This unlikely sisterhood stands as a powerful testament to the enduring human need for connection, even in the most dehumanizing of circumstances. From the unlikely bonds of solidarity forged in shared hardship, let's now examine a more systemic aspect of how medieval society integrated and exploited prostitution, taxation, and guilds, state-sanctioned gain. You see, far from being entirely outside the economic framework, the medieval state, and even some burgeoning proto-guilds, found ways to directly profit from the labor of prostitutes, transforming a morally condemned profession into a consistent source of revenue. The pragmatic approach of many medieval civic authorities towards prostitution often extended beyond mere regulation. It included direct financial benefit. It is a well-documented aspect of the historical record that city councils in numerous European towns actively collected taxes or fees from brothels and the women who worked in them. This revenue, though morally tainted, became a significant and often reliable addition to municipal coffers. These funds could then be used for public works, city defenses, or other civic expenses, effectively making the sin of prostitution contribute to the common good, or at least to the city's budget. You would find these entries discreetly, but clearly, recorded in municipal account books, nestled alongside taxes from markets or tolls, a testament to their regular contribution to the urban economy. The mechanisms for collecting these revenues varied. In cities with officially recognized or municipal brothels, a direct percentage of earnings might be remitted to the city treasurer, or a fixed license fee might be paid by the brothel master or madam. In less formal arrangements, women working independently might be subjected to specific prostitute taxes or levies. This meant that even if a woman managed to earn a small sum, a portion of it was immediately siphoned off by the authorities, further cementing her financial precarity despite contributing to civic wealth. It's like a medieval income tax, but applied with extra layers of moral judgment and less transparency. A particularly intriguing, though less common, phenomenon involves the tangential relationship with guilds. While prostitutes were almost universally excluded from formal craft guilds, which protected the interests of honest trades, some scholars point to instances where certain service guilds, particularly those associated with inns or entertainment, might have had informal connections to prostitution, perhaps by managing facilities or mediating transactions. This suggests a subtle, unacknowledged integration into broader service industries. Moreover, the existence of specific taxes or controls often implies a certain level of administrative recognition, akin to how other trades were managed, further illustrating prostitution's role as a part of the informal, yet vital, urban economy. You can almost envision the city tax collector with his ledger making his rounds to various establishments. Brothels included, a testament to their established, if unofficial, place in the economic landscape. The ongoing academic discussion about the taxation of prostitution often explores the ethical implications of state involvement in a morally condemned activity. Did the collection of taxes implicitly legitimize the profession, or did it merely represent a cynical exploitation of vulnerable women for municipal gain? The consensus leans towards the latter, highlighting that while the revenues benefited the city, they came at the direct expense of the women, who bore the full burden of the exploitation while receiving few, if any, reciprocal protections or benefits from the state. Their daily toil, therefore, not only enriched their madams, but also contributed directly to the maintenance and development of the very cities that publicly scorned them, making their labor a doubly exploited commodity. This entanglement with state finances underscores the complex, often hypocritical, relationship between medieval society and the profession it simultaneously condemned and profited from. From the pragmatic, and often cynical, financial entanglement of prostitution with medieval state coffers, let's now shift to the continuous, yet largely ineffectual, efforts to suppress it. Church reforms, persistent failure. You see, despite the Church's unwavering moral condemnation and repeated attempts to eradicate or control prostitution throughout the Middle Ages, these efforts consistently met with limited success, revealing the enduring power of societal demand and economic realities. The medieval Church wielded immense spiritual and, often, temporal authority. It is a fundamental truth of the era that its moral teachings profoundly shaped societal norms, and its stance on prostitution was clear. It was a grave sin, a violation of divine law, and a stain on the soul. Throughout the centuries, from early church fathers to later papal decrees and local synods, there were continuous calls for the suppression of prostitution. Clerics preached against it from pulpits, theological treatises condemned it, and various church councils issued decrees aimed at eradicating or at least severely restricting its practice. You would witness waves of moral fervor, with reformers attempting to purge cities of disorderly women, often leading to temporary closures of brothels or public exilings. However, despite these relentless efforts, prostitution proved remarkably resilient. The economic realities of poverty, the constant influx of vulnerable women into urban centers, and the persistent male demand for sexual services created a powerful counterforce that continually undermined the church's reforms. Even when brothels were closed, clandestine prostitution would simply proliferate, moving into less visible, unregulated spaces that were often more dangerous for the women involved. This demonstrated the inherent difficulty in legislating morality when deeply ingrained social and economic factors were at play. It's like trying to drain a pond with a sieve. The water just kept finding new ways to flow. A particularly telling example of this persistent failure lies in the very policies enacted by the Church's secular counterparts. As we've discussed, many city councils, despite their own nominal adherence to Christian morality, actively tolerated or even regulated prostitution, precisely because they recognized the futility of outright suppression and the potential for greater social disorder if it were driven entirely underground. This created a tension between ecclesiastical ideals and urban pragmatism, with the latter often winning out. The church might condemn, but the city would manage, indicating a, if uncomfortable, acceptance of what was deemed an unavoidable evil. You can almost hear the sighs of exasperation from bishops witnessing their moral strictures being circumvented by civic economic realities. The academic discussion concerning church reforms against prostitution often highlights this persistent gap between theological ideal and social reality. Were the church's efforts truly ineffective, or did they merely shift the problem rather than solve it? The consensus points to a limited success in eradication, suggesting that while reforms might temporarily disrupt the trade, they rarely eliminated it. Instead, they often pushed it into more informal, less visible, and more dangerous forms. Their daily lives were thus caught in the crossfire of this moral and practical conflict, constantly condemned by one powerful institution, yet often managed, and even implicitly sanctioned, by another, demonstrating the enduring power of human needs and societal structures over even the most fervent religious prohibitions. This historical dynamic underscores how deeply prostitution was interwoven into the fabric of medieval life, resistant to even the most determined attempts at reform. From the persistent, yet largely unsuccessful, efforts of the Church to reform and suppress prostitution, let's now consider the final indignity faced by many medieval prostitutes: death and burial on sanctified ground. You see, even in death, these women were often denied the rights and respectful interment afforded to honest citizens, reflecting the enduring social stigma and religious condemnation that followed them beyond the grave. Medieval society placed immense importance on proper Christian burial. It is a pervasive truth of the era that the manner of one's burial and the location of their final resting place carried profound spiritual and social significance. To be buried in consecrated ground within a churchyard was a sign of piety and community belonging, offering hope for resurrection and eternal salvation. For prostitutes, however, this spiritual comfort was often denied. They were frequently refused burial in sanctified cemeteries, highlighting their enduring status as outcasts even after their lives had ended. You would find their graves relegated to unconsecrated plots on the fringes of towns, in fields, or sometimes in mass graves for the indigent, a physical manifestation of their continued exclusion. The reasons for this denial were deeply rooted in theological and moral condemnation. The Church, in its strict adherence to doctrine, viewed unrepentant prostitutes as living in a state of mortal sin, and therefore unworthy of burial in sacred ground alongside the faithful. This served as a stark warning to others, a public demonstration of the spiritual consequences of their profession. Even if a woman had sought private repentance, her public reputation often superseded her personal faith in the eyes of the community and local clergy. It's like a medieval social judgment that extended its reach into the afterlife, ensuring no peace even in final rest. A particularly grim detail underscores the lack of dignity in their death. Without family willing or able to claim their bodies, or funds for a proper funeral, the bodies of many prostitutes might have been handled by municipal authorities or simply left to the care of the brothel madame, who had little incentive to incur expense for a deceased non-earning asset. Their burials would be hasty, anonymous affairs, often without ceremony or prayer, reflecting the societal contempt they faced in life. There would be no grieving family processions, no tolling bells, and no prayers for their souls offered publicly by the community. You can almost feel the cold indifference of a society turning its back one last time, denying even the final comfort of spiritual rites. The academic discussion concerning the burial practices for medieval prostitutes often highlights the extreme nature of their social and religious marginalization. Did these posthumous indignities genuinely reflect a belief in their eternal damnation, or were they primarily a tool of social control used to deter others from following a similar path? The consensus points to a blend of both, revealing a society that feared moral contagion and used every means, even the treatment of the dead, to enforce its moral boundaries. Their unmarked graves, their denial of sacred ground, and the absence of respectful rites all serve as powerful, silent testimonies to a life lived and ended entirely outside the bounds of conventional medieval society, a final, chilling chapter. In their relentless daily struggle, their death offered no escape from the stigma that had defined their existence. From the ultimate indignity of unsanctified burial, let's now consider how medieval society grappled with the image of prostitutes in its visual culture. Art and iconography, symbolic depictions. You see, while their real lives were often grim and anonymous, prostitutes frequently appeared in medieval art, not as individuals, but as potent symbols used to convey moral lessons, cautionary tales, or even, occasionally, to satirize societal hypocrisy. Medieval art was deeply didactic, intended not just for aesthetic pleasure but to instruct, inspire, and warn viewers about moral conduct. It is a widely acknowledged historical understanding that artists and patrons often employed allegorical figures to represent virtues and vices. In this visual language, the prostitute, or more broadly, the fallen woman, became a recurring motif, almost always depicted in a negative light. You would find her in illuminated manuscripts, on carved misericords, in churches, or in stained glass windows, her presence serving as a stark reminder of the dangers of sin, particularly the sign of lust. She was not a person with a story, but a symbol to be understood and feared. The typical artistic portrayal of a prostitute emphasized her allure and, crucially, her destructive potential. She might be depicted with loose hair, revealing clothing, often the very garments mandated by sumptuary laws to identify her, and an alluring, often seductive, gaze. She might be shown tempting a virtuous man, leading him astray, or engaging in acts of revelry and excess. These depictions were not meant to evoke empathy, but rather fear and moral condemnation. They were visual sermons, reinforcing the Church's teachings about the perils of earthly pleasures. It's like a medieval public service announcement, but delivered through paint and stone, with a very clear warning label. A particularly intriguing aspect of these symbolic depictions is their occasional use in satire or as commentary on societal hypocrisy. While the primary function was moralistic, some secular art or marginalia in manuscripts might subtly, or even overtly, use the figure of the prostitute to critique the corruption of clergy, the excesses of the nobility, or the general moral failings of society at large. In these rare instances, her presence might be less about her own sin and more about the sins of those who condemned her, or those who frequented her services. This offered a nuanced, if still unflattering, perspective on the moral landscape of the time. You can almost see a mischievous artist subtly drawing a cleric in a compromising position near a stylized, loose woman in the margins of a holy text. The ongoing academic discussion concerning the portrayal of prostitutes in medieval art often explores the tension between condemnation and recognition. Did these symbolic depictions contribute to their dehumanization, or did they, by acknowledging their presence, inadvertently cement their place as a recognizable, if reviled, part of the social fabric? The consensus points to a strong emphasis on their symbolic function over any attempt at realistic portrayal or human empathy. Their image in medieval art was a powerful tool for moral instruction, ensuring that even when a real prostitute was out of sight, her symbolic representation was ever present, reminding medieval society of the constant battle between virtue and vice, and solidifying her enduring, condemned role in the visual landscape. Her daily life, though unseen in these grand narratives, was the grim reality from which these moral symbols were drawn. From the symbolic and often moralistic depictions in medieval art, let's now turn to how prostitutes found their way into the written narratives of the era, literary portrayals, bawdy and bitter. You see, medieval literature, spanning from comedic tales to tragic narratives, often featured prostitutes not just as background figures, but as characters who, despite their marginalized status, played significant roles, reflecting a complex mix of societal judgment, fascination, and occasional, if rare, empathy. Medieval literature, in its various forms, served as a mirror to society, often exaggerating or satirizing its customs and characters. It is a compelling historical insight that prostitutes, or women engaged in illicit sexual activity, frequently appeared in popular genres such as folblios, short, humorous, often bawdy tales, romances, miracle plays, and even more serious moral treatises. Unlike their static representations in art, literary portrayals allowed for a more dynamic, albeit still often two-dimensional, exploration of their character and circumstances. You would find them as central figures in comedic escapades, as cautionary examples in moralistic poems, or as tragic figures lamenting their fate. The typical literary portrayal often leaned heavily into stereotype. In comedic or bawdy tales, prostitutes might be depicted as shrewd, manipulative figures, cunningly outwitting foolish clients or unsuspecting citizens. Their dialogues could be sharp, their actions audacious, often serving to highlight the follies of others rather than their own moral failings. These narratives, while entertaining, rarely offered deep insight into their lives, primarily using them as props for humor or satire. It's like a medieval sitcom, where the prostitute character provided the risk humor, but never the genuine emotional depth, a more poignant and rarer form of literary portrayal presented a bitter perspective, sometimes allowing for a glimpse into the tragic realities of their existence. In some moralistic poems or allegories, a prostitute might be depicted lamenting her fallen state, expressing regret or yearning for redemption. These portrayals, often tied to the theme of repentance, offered a fleeting moment of empathy, acknowledging the difficult circumstances that might have led a woman to such a life or the suffering inherent in it. Such narratives, while still didactic, hinted at an underlying recognition of their humanity beyond their profession. You can almost hear the sorrowful voice of a character in a poem, reciting a monologue about the life she lost or the future she yearned for. The ongoing academic discussion concerning literary portrayals of prostitutes often explores the tension between condemnation, humor, and occasional sympathy. Did these narratives, by humanizing them even slightly, challenge prevailing social attitudes, or did they simply reinforce existing stereotypes for entertainment or moral instruction? The consensus suggests that while the overwhelming majority of literary mentions served to reinforce negative stereotypes or deliver moral lessons, the occasional instances of more complex or sympathetic portrayal offer tantalizing hints of a more nuanced societal perception among certain writers or audiences. Their daily lives, though sensationalized or moralized, provided rich material for storytellers, ensuring that their presence, however controversial, was etched into the imaginative landscape of medieval literature, making them a recurring, if often misrepresented, character in the tales of the age. From the literary narratives that depicted prostitutes in various lights, let's now turn to a critical, yet largely ineffective, aspect of managing the consequences of their profession: disease management, limited interventions. You see, medieval society, lacking modern medical knowledge and public health infrastructure, could only offer rudimentary and often brutal attempts to control the spread of venereal diseases within brothels, efforts that ultimately offered little protection to the women themselves. The widespread presence of venereal diseases was an undeniable reality in medieval cities, particularly within populations frequently exposed to multiple sexual partners. It is a stark historical truth that while the exact microbial causes of diseases like syphilis, which became rampant in the late 15th century, or gonorrhea, were unknown, their devastating symptoms, genital sores, rashes, chronic pain, and disfigurement, were all too visible. This created a public health concern that even medieval authorities, despite their limited understanding, could not entirely ignore. You would find civic leaders grappling with the visible signs of disease, trying to implement measures, however primitive, to contain what they perceived as a moral and physical contagion. The interventions undertaken were typically crude and reactive. In some regulated brothels, there might have been attempts at periodic inspections of the women, often by non-medical personnel, to identify obvious signs of illness. If a woman was found to be visibly diseased, she might be temporarily removed from service, isolated, or even expelled from the city. The goal was not to cure her, but to prevent the spread of disease to other clients, or, by extension, to the wider, respectable population. This approach, driven by fear and lacking any effective treatments, offered no real medical care to the afflicted women. It's like a medieval quarantine, but without any hope of recovery for those cast out. A particularly disturbing detail highlights the brutal reality of these interventions. For women suffering from advanced venereal diseases, their physical decline often meant disfigurement and debilitating pain. With no antibiotics or palliative care, their lives were characterized by prolonged suffering. The societal response was typically one of ostracism and abandonment, rather than treatment or compassion. These women, once economically viable, became burdens, quickly discarded by brothel owners and left to their own devices, often dying in extreme poverty. You can almost feel the despair of a woman witnessing her body betraying her, knowing that her physical decay meant an inevitable, lonely end. With no medical science to offer even a sliver of hope, the ongoing academic discussion concerning disease management in medieval prostitution often highlights the systemic failure to protect the women involved. Were these interventions genuinely about public health, or were they primarily about maintaining a clean supply of women for male clients and preventing the spread of disease to men? The evidence points to the latter, emphasizing that the focus was on containment and protection of the male population, with little regard for the well-being or medical needs of the prostitutes themselves. Their daily lives were thus marked not only by the constant threat of infection, but also by the brutal reality that illness meant immediate economic ruin and social abandonment, underscoring the profound and uncared-for suffering inherent in their profession. This history of limited and often cruel interventions serves as a stark reminder of the devastating human cost of medieval society's approach to sexual health. From the stark and often brutal realities of medieval disease management, we now arrive at the final reflection on the lives of medieval prostitutes. Legacy, enduring stigma, quiet resilience. You see, while their profession was profoundly condemned and their individual stories often erased, these women left an undeniable, if often unacknowledged, mark on medieval society, embodying a quiet resilience in the face of overwhelming adversity. The prevailing societal attitude towards prostitutes in the Middle Ages left an indelible stigma that transcended their lifetimes. It is a fundamental truth of history that the moral condemnation, social ostracism, and legal disenfranchisement they faced in life continued to shape their posthumous memory, often denying them dignified burial and erasing their individual narratives from public record. This created a legacy of invisibility, where their contributions to urban economies and their complex daily struggles were largely ignored in favor of a simplistic, moralistic narrative. You would find their existence acknowledged more in tax, ledgers, or legal condemnations than in personal histories or tributes. However, beneath this crushing stigma lay an undeniable, if often overlooked, resilience. Despite facing systemic exploitation, chronic poverty, pervasive violence, and the constant threat of disease, many women in prostitution found ways to survive, to form bonds of solidarity, and even to seek personal solace or redemption. Their ability to navigate such a perilous existence, to endure unimaginable hardship day after day, speaks volumes about the strength of the human spirit. They adapted to circumstances, developed coping mechanisms, and, in their own ways, resisted complete dehumanization. It's like a hidden strength, a quiet defiance that persisted even when all external forces sought to break them. A particularly poignant aspect of their legacy lies in the enduring questions their lives raise about medieval society itself. The persistent presence of prostitution, despite fervent condemnation, forces us to confront the hypocrisy and complex pragmatism of the era. It reveals the gap between moral ideals and social realities, the economic desperation that drove women into the trade, and the male demand that sustained it. Their stories, even when fragmented, illuminate the darker corners of urban life and the often unseen exploitation that underpinned medieval economies. You can almost hear their silent voices challenging the clean, romanticized narratives of the past, demanding recognition for their suffering and their endurance. The ongoing academic discussion about the legacy of medieval prostitutes often strives to move beyond simplistic moral judgments and towards a more nuanced understanding of their experiences. Were they merely passive victims, or did they possess agency and resilience within their constrained lives? The contemporary approach emphasizes recognizing their humanity, understanding the systemic forces that shaped their existence, and acknowledging their often unrecorded contributions to the social and economic fabric of the time. Their daily grind, their quiet acts of survival, and their profound suffering all contribute to a richer, more complete understanding of medieval society. Their legacy, therefore, is not just one of enduring stigma, but also one of quiet resilience, a testament to the strength found in navigating extraordinary adversity, and a constant reminder of the unseen lives that shape the world we inhabit. They remain, in many ways, the unacknowledged backbone of an inconvenient truth echoing through the centuries.